I'm joined now by a lecturer of politics and international relations at the Liverpool Hope University, Dr. Bola Adediran. Dr. Adediran, thank you for joining us on The World Now. Unlike the position of the West, we've seen countries like India, Iran, North Korea, and China backing the election results coming from Russia. You know, some have said this is perhaps a situation where the Western standard of democracy doesn't fit everyone in the world, and perhaps this better suits the Russian public.
Well, I don't think it's a question of whether it's a Western standard of democracy. A democracy has some minimum requirements and minimum thresholds, and when we see it, when we see the values of democracy being undermined across the world, regardless of where it is, we have to call it out. What has gone on in Russia is not democracy. What has gone on in Russia over the last how many years is authoritarianism disguised as democracy. It is a leader picking and choosing who stands against him, and deciding that anybody with any kind of following or traction will either be eliminated, as in the case of Alexei Navalny, or prevented from putting themselves forward, as in the case of the case of many of his opposition. So I don't think that is what democracy is. What democracy is about participation. It is about freedom to elect and to choose, and that's not what we've seen in Russia.
I understand the narrative of silencing opposition and, you know, the issue of free speech, but are you also paying attention to the voter turnout? 77%. That's more than the voter turnout in America during the presidential election in 2020. So the question is he also forcing the people to come out to vote? Because if they don't support Putin, they could as well have sat down at their, in their homes and not come out for the exercise, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that Western democracy has suffered over the last few years, and we even saw it in Nigeria during the last election, it's low voter apathy. And that is something that Western democracies have to deal with. But democracy also involves much more than just voter turnout. Voter turnout is great, but let's also not forget that in the case of Russia, the Russians have a saying, a philosophy that the ballot can go to the voter, right? So in some cases, like for example, the voting that went on in the Donbas region in Ukraine, you had election officials taking the ballot to the people in their houses and asking them to vote in a certain way. So when we look at the voter turnout and we dissect it, we can also see how it is possible for that large amount of percentage of Russians voting, as you've rightly pointed out. But as I mentioned, I don't think I am not personally fooled by the large percentage of people who have turned out to vote. It is what is more concerning is the fact that the oppositions have been silenced, and that the Russian president has imposed himself on the Russian people.
You know, I'm just saying that perhaps Putin is more more accepted in Russia than the West is willing to admit when you consider these figures in the real sense of it.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I would not question and I would not doubt is that Putin is popular in Russia. Let's get that. Let's get those facts right. Putin is well accepted, is well liked. His strongman idea, his strongman persona fits well with Russian culture. But having said that, so he has some form of legitimacy as a popular leader. But in terms of the real crucibles of democracy, right? And those things are important in terms of really creating an atmosphere of fairness. They were not there in this election, and this is my own grouse about the electioneering process. That in an atmosphere of suppression, opposition and silencing of opposition, we cannot say that democracy has really taken place. But you're absolutely correct. Putin is a well-liked figure and is a very popular figure in Russia, more than we give him credit for in some instances.
So let us attempt to draw a comparison between Russia and America, for instance. If America portrays that perfect example of a free society, some have said, look at the 2024 election and look at the two prominent candidates and whether or not they portray the highest quality of candidates in any democracy in the world. The octogenarian who is incumbent and then the man who wants to return as president. My question really is, do you think that democracy has worked in an exemplary manner, for the U.S., for instance?
Well, let us be clear that there is no perfect democracy anywhere in the world, right? And I say that knowing that people would say, well, why don't you say that, why do you not consider Russia as a democracy but with imperfections? In the U.S., what you have, yes, they are not the perfect candidates. They are octogenarians, as you have mentioned, and there are many cause for concerns. And some people have actually said that what we are experiencing in the West, particularly in the U.S., is what you call sort of democratic backsliding or democratic decay, right? That democracy itself is decaying in those places. But having said that, you could still see that even in a situation where there are clear divisions within the U.S. society between Republicans and Democrats, there is still an acceptance of certain rules, right? So Democrats are in government at the moment, and regardless of how much they hate Trump, they are not going to silence Trump without going through the due process. That means going to the Supreme Court and asking whether Trump should be allowed to stand. And from what indications that we have had, the Supreme Court has actually struck down some of the attempts to disqualify Trump. So we see democratic institutions holding forth and standing and being resilient. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you contrast that with Russia, where the three candidates that stood alongside Vladimir Putin were almost unpicked, right? The most that any of them gained was 4%, and that was the Communist Party candidate, Nikolai something. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you contrast that, you see that democratic institutions are still holding forth in the U.S., regardless of all the divisions and the concerns that we're having about the state of democracy in the U.S. And that's an important point.
Indeed. I hear you clearly and I get your point. However, on the other side is also the huge amount of delay that democratic bureaucracy, bring to the implementation of government policy. And we've seen that play out in the past years in America, for instance. But that's our time. Lecturer of Politics and International Relations at the Liverpool Hope University, Dr. Bola Adediran, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.